The shears were still warm in my hand when the phone buzzed. I had been trimming the bougainvillea along the porch rail, the blooms spilling over in shades of magenta that always made the house look alive. My back ached the way it always did these days, but it was a good ache, the kind that reminded me I still kept things in order. Alina's name lit up the screen. My heart jumped ridiculous as that sounds. Months had passed since she called without Daniel hovering in the background. I wiped my hands on my gardening apron, steadied my breath, and answered. "Hi, Mom," she said, her voice flat, more businesslike than affectionate. "Sweetheart," I said, forcing warmth. "I was just wondering when the big day is. I'll need to arrange time off." The silence stretched, then the words came clean and sharp. "Oh, we already got married yesterday. Just a small ceremony in Los Angeles. Only people who matter were invited." For a moment, the Pacific breeze vanished. My throat locked. Only people who matter. I raised her alone. I worked double shifts at Scripps so she could have private school. Every scraped knee, every exam, every holiday I had been there. And now I didn't matter. I swallowed the sting, my voice steady. "I see. Well, congratulations." "Thanks," she said, suddenly lighter. "Daniel and I thought it would be less stressful this way. But we do need one thing. Can you send us the keys to the beach house? Daniel says it would be perfect for our honeymoon. He's always wanted to see La Jolla in the fall." There it was. Not joy. Not sharing her happiness. Just the house. The sanctuary Richard's insurance money had bought. The place where Alina learned to swim roasted marshmallows, declared barefoot at 12 she would marry on that sand someday. "Of course, sweetheart. I'll make sure you get the keys." "Great. Thanks, Mom." The line went dead. No mention of a dress, a cake, a photo. Just the demand. I set the phone down, staring past the bougainvillea to the restless horizon. I wasn't simply excluded. I had been erased. The waves rolled steady, but inside me, something shifted, small but certain. If Daniel thought he could take my daughter and the house, he had underestimated me. Because this wasn't their honeymoon. This was the beginning of my plan. After I hung up, I stayed on the porch until the sun dropped lower, the air thick with salt. My eyes kept drifting north toward La Jolla. That house had never been just a place on the map. It was the only proof I hadn't completely lost everything after Richard died. I bought it with the insurance payout, what was left once medical bills stripped us bare. I can still remember signing the papers, my hand trembling. Everyone told me I should rent a cheaper apartment, save for Alina's future, keep things practical. But I needed more than practicality. I needed a place where grief didn't swallow us whole. That cottage with peeling paint and sand-stained floors became the only space where we could breathe again. We built a life there in small rituals. Summer evenings roasting marshmallows until our fingers stuck together with sugar. Alina squealing as the tide chased her ankles. Me watching from the shore, equal parts proud and terrified when she first balanced on a surfboard. Even rainy nights held their own kind of warmth. We'd drag blankets into the living room, light a fire, and let the storm rattle the windows while we laughed at silly movies. There's one memory that never fades. She was 12, hair wild from the wind toes buried in the sand. She looked out at the horizon and said, "So certain, Mom, I'll get married here someday." I smiled then because I believed her. That house was supposed to be the setting for beginnings, not a bargaining chip for someone else's comfort. Now Daniel wanted it like it was nothing more than a rental unit. Alina repeated his words so casually, as if the years spent under that roof meant nothing at all. Inside my bungalow, I went to the desk in the corner and pulled open the drawer. The deed sat where it always had folded, crisp, tucked into an envelope I had touched more times than I'd admit. I pressed it flat against my palm. That house wasn't just property. It was memory. It was survival. It was legacy. And if Daniel thought he could strip that away, he was about to learn what kind of fight he had walked into. I can still see that evening as if it were etched in glass. Alina had asked me to make my lasagna, the one she begged for every birthday. She wanted everything perfect for me to meet the man she said was different from all the rest. I remember setting the table with my grandmother's china, smoothing the linen napkins, and telling myself, maybe, just maybe, this was the moment my daughter's life would finally feel secure. Daniel arrived at the door in a navy suit so sharp it looked borrowed from a commercial. He held a dozen roses red as blood and called me Mrs. Grant, like he'd rehearsed the line in the mirror. His handshake was firm, his teeth too white, his gaze steady, but a shade too practiced. All night, he said the right things. He complimented my cooking as though each bite was divine. He insisted on clearing the table, rolled up his sleeves, and washed dishes, while Alina stood behind him, beaming with pride. Any mother would have been relieved, even grateful to see her daughter adored that way. And I tried to be, but I noticed. 3 separate times he circled back to the beach house. Alina says you've owned it for 20 years, he said, twirling pasta with the casual ease of someone testing bait. That must be incredible property value on the Pacific. Do you rent it out? Ever thought of selling? I smiled politely and gave him the same answer each time, it's not for sale. He chuckled, quick to agree. Of course, of course. Family history is priceless. But his eyes lingered a little too long, as though they were measuring more than sentiment. That night after they left, I stood at the sink with my hands in warm water, replaying every moment. Alina's laughter had been genuine. She looked lighter than I'd seen in years. But his interest had not been in her childhood stories or her dreams. It had been in square footage and market value. I wanted to believe I was imagining it. I wanted to believe love, not calculation, had walked through my door. But deep down, something in me had already begun to brace for the storm he carried with him. After that first dinner, I told myself to give him a chance. People deserve the benefit of time, I thought. But as the months rolled on, I began to see how Daniel's presence rearranged my daughter's orbit. Our weekly calls dwindled. At first, she claimed she was busy with work. Then it became, Daniel thinks couples should focus on each other. Mom, you understand, right? The words stung because they didn't sound like her. They sounded like something fed to her rehearsed until she could repeat them without thinking. I tried to ignore it, but silence has a way of shouting when it comes from your only child. Days would pass without a message. Weekends that once belonged to our beach walks disappeared into dinners with his colleagues or trips with his family. When she did call, Daniel's voice often floated in the background, nudging, guiding, reminding her of something more important. The real breaking point came one morning when I opened Facebook half awake, scrolling past recipes and old friends' updates. A photograph stopped me cold. Alina's hand fingers spread a diamond catching the sunlight. The caption read, "He asked, I said yes. Can't wait to start forever with you." 53 likes. Dozens of comments from friends and coworkers. Not one mention of me, not one assumption that I hadn't already known. My coffee cooled untouched as I stared at the screen, feeling the kind of emptiness that only comes from being blindsided. I called immediately. She answered, breathless with excitement. "Mom, oh my God, I'm so sorry. It just happened last night. We were caught up in the moment. Daniel surprised me at our favorite restaurant." I forced my voice steady. "Congratulations, sweetheart. Tell me everything." And she did about the ring, the champagne, the way Daniel's parents already started planning. When I asked about the engagement party, she hesitated. "It's really for his family. His mother's traditional. You understand, right?" I hung up that night with trembling hands. My daughter's future was unfolding in front of me, yet my place in it was shrinking by the day. And somewhere deep inside, I began to realize this was only the beginning of losing her. It was late on a Tuesday when the phone rang again. I almost didn't answer. Part of me already knew nothing good would come from hearing her voice tethered to his. But habit is hard to break, and love harder still. Mom Alina began too casually. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be cool about it. My stomach tightened. Nothing good ever followed words like that. It's about the beach house, she said. Daniel feels uncomfortable there. Like it's not really ours, you know? Like he's under a microscope every time we visit. Maybe it's time you just sign it over. I always assumed I'd inherit it anyway. Her words landed like blows. That house had been bought with the last of Richard's insurance. It was the only tangible piece of him left in our lives. The place where I rebuilt us after death had hollowed me out. Every board, every memory was soaked with years of survival and love. And now she wanted it gone, not with reverence, but with entitlement. I cleared my throat, willing my voice to stay steady. Alina, that house isn't just property. It's where you learned to swim. It's where your father's picture has hung since the day we moved in. It's home. I know, Mom, I do. She said, though. Her tone carried Daniel's cadence more than her own. But Daniel feels like it's pressure on us. Like we'll never have our own space if everything ties back to you. The words stung, indebted. I had never asked Daniel for anything. Never scrutinized him in that house, never demanded repayment. I had simply offered it as the space it always was ours. I forced a small pause before answering. I'll think about it, I said. She seemed relieved, thanked me quickly, and hung up. I stayed seated at the edge of my bed, long after staring at the framed photograph of her as a child, cheeks sunburned from the La Jolla tide, laughing in my arms. She had once looked at me like I was her whole world. Now she asked me to give it away. And though I whispered I'd think about it inside me, something hardened. After that call, I knew silence would cost me everything. Sitting back, hoping Alina would wake up on her own, wasn't enough anymore. If Daniel wanted the house, he'd find new ways to circle closer, and I couldn't let that happen. I reached out to Victor Hayes, a retired detective I remembered from Richard's side of the family. He'd worked cases with my brother-in-law back in the day, and rumor was he still did private work. We met at a small coffee shop tucked between a bookstore and an antique store downtown. The kind of place where conversations blended into the hum of tourists and no one asked questions. When he arrived, I slid a folded photo across the table. Daniel smiling too perfectly at our first dinner. Something isn't right, I told him. I need to know who this man really is. Victor studied the photo, his eyes narrowing. He nodded once. Leave it with me. A week later, we met again, this time in his quiet office lined with old case files. He pushed a folder toward me. You were right to worry. I opened it slowly, my breath catching with each page. Marriage licenses that never led to weddings. 2 broken engagements, one to a woman whose father owned a chain of restaurants, another to the daughter of a real estate family. In both cases, Daniel had isolated them from their families, pressed for financial trust, then vanished when suspicions surfaced. There were bank reports, too. Shady withdrawals accounts with names that didn't match. But the page that cut deepest was an old newspaper clipping. Victor had tucked near the back. William Morrison, he said quietly. Daniel's grandfather. The headline blurred before my eyes. Local developer accused of embezzling millions. Richard's name appeared 3 paragraphs down. His partner, betrayed, bankrupt. I sat back, my chest tight. Richard had spoken little about that failed deal before his health collapsed, but now the truth was staring at me. The man who ruined my husband's life had a grandson trying to finish the job. And if Daniel thought I would sit by while history repeated itself, he didn't know me at all. Once Victor placed the last file in my hands, the The weight of it became something more than paper. It was proof that my instincts had not betrayed me, that Daniel was not only a fraud, but a continuation of the very betrayal that had crippled Richard's life. I didn't want to shout it at my daughter. Shouting never changes anyone already under a spell. No, this required precision. At my kitchen table, I laid everything out in neat stacks. The failed engagements, the bank withdrawals, the clipped headlines that still smelled faintly of dust. I added Richard's estate documents highlighting Alina's rightful inheritance. Together they told a story Daniel could never explain away. I chose a leather portfolio to hold it all. Something clean, understated, impossible to ignore once opened. Then I wrapped it in silver paper I had left from Christmas, tied it with a satin bow. I slipped a card under the ribbon, handwritten in my most careful script. Every new husband should know his wife's family history. Congratulations, Celine. The package looked almost festive, like something chosen from a registry. I carried it to their apartment downtown, the Gaslamp Quarter, busy with tourists. People brushed past me, laughing, arms full of shopping bags, unaware I was carrying the undoing of a man. I set the box on their doormat, rang the bell once, and walked away without waiting. By late afternoon, my phone lit up with his number. I answered, my voice steady. "You witch!" Daniel's voice cracked through the line, frantic, unhinged. "How dare you send us this garbage?" I set my coffee cup down carefully on the table. "Hello, Daniel. I take it you opened your wedding gift. This isn't funny. This is harassment. I'll call the police." "Report me then," I said evenly. "Tell them your mother-in-law gave you a package filled with public records and archived newspaper clippings. I'm sure they'll be fascinated." Silence filled the line. For the first time, his tone shifted. "You're lying." "I never lie," I replied softly. "I was a nurse. We deal in facts." The anger in his voice faltered, and beneath it I heard the first strain of fear. 2 days passed in a haze of waiting. Every time the phone rang, I half expected more of Daniel's rage, but the silence was louder than his voice. On the second morning, I opened my front door and found Alina standing on the porch. Her eyes were swollen, her hair unbrushed. Her shoulders slumped like the weight of her world had finally pressed her flat. "Mom," she whispered, barely audible. "Tell me everything." I stepped aside without a word, and she walked in, clutching a manila folder. At the kitchen table, she spread out pages, printouts from Daniel's laptop. Lines of emails scrolled across them, each one colder than the last. He had been corresponding with someone named Marcus Webb about accessing old Morrison accounts, offshore funds, siphoned through shell corporations. The earliest message was dated 2 years before she'd even met him. Her voice cracked as she explained, "He researched me. He knew about Dad, about the beach house. Meeting me wasn't an accident. It was a plan." She pulled out her phone and scrolled through call logs. "I spoke to Emma Harrison and Sarah Blake, his ex-fiancés. Same story, Mom. He isolates, he pushes for control of assets, and when it doesn't work, he disappears." Word for word. Her hands trembled as she set the phone down. Tears slid down her cheeks, but her eyes burned with something sharper. "And I believed him over you. I shut you out. I let him turn me against you." She reached across the table, her fingers curling over mine. "But not anymore. Now I want him ruined." I squeezed her hand, steadying the tremor in her grip. For the first time in years, I saw the fire in her that had been buried under his shadow. The little girl who once declared barefoot on the beach that she'd marry there someday was still inside her, fierce, certain, unafraid of truth. We sat together in silence, our hands locked across the wood grain, the distance between us, closing in that small but unshakable gesture. And as I looked at her, I knew the time had come to move from gathering truth to using it. The folder between us wasn't just paper anymore. It was a weapon. Alina and I carried it to the FBI field office, nerves sharp but steady. Agent Elena Ruiz met us in a conference room, her dark eyes scanning each page. When she finally looked up, her voice carried the weight of confirmation. "You were right," she said. "Daniel Morrison has been on our radar for months. Your evidence fills in the gaps we couldn't close. If you're willing, we can set up a controlled operation." Alina didn't hesitate. "I'll do it." By Friday night, the plan was in motion. Daniel came home with a bouquet of roses, his expression soft remorse painted across his face like stage makeup. He kissed her cheek, murmured about fresh starts, about building trust again. She let him talk her blouse, concealing the wire taped beneath her skin. I waited with the agents in a van parked down the street, headphones tight against my ears, heart pounding with every sound that filtered through. At first, his words dripped with apology. "I've made mistakes, Alina, but we can fix everything." Then the mask slipped. His tone dropped intimate and calculated. "All I need is access to your accounts. Once the money moves, it's ours forever." Alina's voice was steady, though I knew her hands must have been trembling. "So, you admit you married me for the inheritance?" "Yes." He whispered, his smoothness returning like oil on water. "And you should be grateful. We're building something bigger than you could ever do on your own." That was the cue. The door burst open, a flood of voices and heavy footsteps filling the apartment. FBI hands. Where we can see them. Daniel's polished smile collapsed into raw panic, his roses scattering across the floor as agents forced him down, cold cuffs snapping around his wrists. Through the open mic, I heard his protests dissolve into stammers. For the first time, he sounded less like a man in control and more like the child of a thief caught in the same old game. And as they pulled him out, I knew we were finally free to let the truth stand on its own. The trial moved faster than I expected. Once the recordings were played in court, once the bank records and testimony from the other women were laid bare, there wasn't much left of Daniel's polished exterior. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning the verdict guilty on every count of fraud and conspiracy. The judge's gavel struck with finality, sentencing him to 12 years in federal prison. Restitution from his siphoned accounts would be returned to his victims, and through the tangled web of stolen funds, Alina recovered a portion of what had once belonged to her father's estate. Nearly $4 million, numbers on paper that could never repay the years of heartbreak, but still a reclamation of what was lost. When we walked out of the courthouse together, Alina slipped her hand into mine. It wasn't about the money, not really. It was about something quieter, something neither of us could quantify. Trust broken and now slowly mended, pressed between our palms. That evening, we drove to La Jolla, the place that had been at the center of all of it. The beach house waited, weathered but strong, just as it always had. We carried old photo albums out to the porch, the salt air wrapping around us as the tide pulled in steady breaths. We turned the pages together, sunburned noses, lopsided sand castles. Richard, holding Alina high above the water. Laughter came easily, mixing with the sound of waves. For the first time in years, I felt the house breathe again, filled not with tension, but with the sound of us. Alina closed one album and set it on her lap. Her eyes softened, but her voice was certain. "Next time I marry, it'll be barefoot on this sand with someone who loves you as much as me." I reached over and took her hand, my thumb brushing the back of it the way I used to when she was little and afraid of the ocean. The tide rolled steady the horizon, stretching endless and wide, as if reminding us that some bonds, no matter how frayed, can be mended by truth. And in that quiet, I felt the shore restored.